My origin story. My name is Perfectia Dawnlight, just in case you forgot, but don't forget, because she's the main character, and if you refer to me as main character, I will find you a say. The main character from Perfectia Dawnlight's diary is named Perfectia Dawnlight, not main character. But I am the main character, so even my stupidest plans worked out, and spoiler alert, I don't die in the end. So Perfectia Dawnlight, me, of the houses of Dawnstar Village, daughter of Keldonus Dawnlight, a noble of Dawnstar houses, my mother, and a commoner high elf named Lachance, my father. This is my sour attempt to write an autobiography from the start to finish, and in 22 years of being here, I don't think it shouldn't be too long, but I'm a little surprised that my self-deprecating introduction filled out as many pages as it did. So my father was a librarian, as I remember back then. As far back as I can remember, I was waited on hand and foot by servants and slaves that spoiled me, and I was very starved for attention. I remember tantruming, breaking things, making impossible orders to slaves, and telling on them to servants and butlers because my mother was extremely distant with me, and as was my father, I didn't know what he was at the time, and neither did he. I was called the bastard child she decided to keep, but my mother said she gave me the name Perfectia for within the moment I was born she could never imagine a more perfect moment. When I was dipped in the Sunwell's water, I was told that my eyes glowed like 1,000 suns. Perfect was the only way she could describe it, and as relatives gave her a list of names, she paid little attention to them, and Perfectia just kind of stuck. I still remember those conversations when I was 3, when my mother was my entire world and she couldn't be more grateful to have me in her life. I think I was good then. I still remember being small, barely able to walk, and scaling the walls as I walked around curiously. My mother's beautiful blonde curled hair that bounced like springs as I pulled them, her light blue glowing eyes, and me wanting to be carried whenever I would let her. For so long I remember feeling like a sacred possession she refused to put down or let anyone touch. I walked with her, I drank with her, I took in the Sunwell's magic with her, and as far back as I can remember I shared the same bed with her. Even though I remember seeing people bring gnome textrollers, my mother always held me in her arms, or at the very most kept me on her back when she was on a mount. She did put me down sometimes, but I was never away from her worried gaze as I played with or tried to play with other children. But I got a lot older and started talking for myself. I saw other kids not just with mothers, but fathers as well. They picked up their children the same way my mother did. They had this feeling of protection, but it wasn't overprotective like my mother's was. Mothers seemed to be rested, content, and nurturing. I asked my mother what a daddy or father was in a way a 2.5-year-old child could, with a lot of pointing, and what mommy. I remember my 3rd birthday very clearly. I had aunts, uncles, handfuls of cousins, and most of them were old, but there were a few newborns as well. All of us had the word Dawn somewhere in our last name. Dawnbreaker, Donna, Dawnsong, Dawnrich. Most of us had blonde hair, but there were some lighter reds in the bunch too, but blacks and browns were usually seen from servants and slaves. But there were a few noble houses that had black hair, but no one that was in my family. It was somewhat of the first time I really had eaten anything, but the food platter that was given to us was all sweets and assorted fruits, and then there were the colors. Almost like a stream of greens, blues, and oranges that wanted to dance in front of me like streams of curious snakes. My mother sat next to me and asked, "Do you like the fruit, Perfectia?" Somewhat distracted trying to grab the images in front of me, I shook my head. "Do you not like the taste?" She asked. Taste? That was a familiar sense, but only when it came to the touches of magical objects or spells. The things that smelled just smelled. The oranges smelled like oranges. The grass smelled like grass. The smell of burnt wood smelled like burnt wood. But that feeling on the tongue was only intensified by things of a magical sort, not food. If I closed my eyes and put something in my mouth, I would barely taste anything, just texture and a sinking feeling down my throat. I decided that I didn't like this feeling. It made my mother worried seeing me try to grab things that weren't there. Synesthesia it was called, but for the most part with this special occasion it was the first time I ate anything, so it was never brought up again. As a high elf living so close to the Sunwell, there was never a need to eat for nourishment, just reasons to stay hydrated, and the Sunwell produced its own water. A few months after my third birthday, I was talking a lot more, asking my mother questions more and more about the males in my family. Why did most kids have two people taking care of them only to get back small sentence responses like, "He's not here," or "He's away"? Then one morning she was gone, not gone like I never saw her again. We just had a morning routine of going to the Sunwell, going to a park, and then some kind of educational class where I would be working with a teacher that would watch me play with toys or show me letters in the process of teaching me how to read. There was a black-haired servant I didn't know at the time, and neither did he, but he was my father, and he was a lot more distant than my overprotective mother. He didn't hold me for more than a minute, and while in classrooms he would sit there filing his nails or doing something with his hair. That day I didn't see my mother until nightfall, and I told her that I missed her and didn't like this LaChance person. He shrugged dismissively and said, "You hired me to clean and find you new books for your library, not look after your child." My mother Caldonis looked at him, sighed, and shook her head. "You're not going to fire me, are you? I did everything you asked. She's not hurt. I kept her safe, guarded her with my life, like you said." He explained. "No," she said dismissively, "I'm putting you on assignment. There's some books in Coltira's I need from Dalen Proudmore, and he wrote to me that his next book is almost complete. Also, he needs some of mine. If his book isn't complete, stay there and assist him until it is. I want the first copy that comes out of the press. That's halfway across the planet. Without the Sunwell." Mother interrupted, "There are mana potions you can buy, and you can sustain yourself with normal food. Besides, it's not like you need the Sunwell to keep yourself going." Servants and slaves couldn't use any forms of magic. Mother handed LaChance a pile of papers, and he left for his assignment. She bent down to me and said, "I'm sorry, Perfectia, but Mommy needs to work now, but don't worry, I'll fix this." After that day, I never knew I could miss my mother's overprotective nature, those prying eyes, and those defensive stances that scared even the most arrogant of nobles away. Things without her weren't bad, but if I was far away, I would hear her running toward me. If I looked around because I thought I had lost her, she would wave to reassure me. While LaChance may have shot a glance at me to make sure I was okay, he was more interested in his own thoughts or speaking to what he might have thought were single mothers or lonely housewives. Working with educators, he only spoke in dismissive grunts and shrugs. I didn't tell my mother anything else or he would have been fired, but I wondered when my mother was going to come by our house most of the day. That first day with only spending time with servants was the most painful. I thought she died, even with people reassuring me that she was just working. That anger, that rage, was foreign at the time, but it was so painful to hold it in, and I didn't know how to let go of it, and I remember sleeping in our bed alone terrified for the first night. The second day of waking up without my mother in my bed, the rage found an outlook of screaming, crying, and breaking things. The whole day was a literal wrestling match to get me to dress, eat, bathe, and stay quiet. I remember screaming for my mother that whole day, and I wouldn't listen to the excuses that she was busy, working, or not there. She finally came back a little before sundown, but only to tell me that she was disappointed in my behavior, and I would be sleeping in my own room from then on. The second night wasn't terrifying, but I felt completely abandoned. From the time I was 5, I had 2 to 7 servants escorting me around the Sunwell Plateau. Also, on the occasion I would see my mother, I would say which servant I liked, which servant I didn't like, and which educator was boring, mean, or ugly. How I didn't like the way a certain servant dressed me, or carried me, or fed me, or just simply was not listening to my needs. Some of the servants said no to me in spite of my yelling, pestering, or tantruming. I usually didn't see them again. But it wasn't just servants and slaves whose lives I made a living hell. The kids I saw got a big chunk of my personal terror that I could inflict in parks and businesses. Even at the Sunwell I was avoided, and that just made me angrier. I wanted them to do what I said, play the games I wanted to play. If they had toys I wanted, I would take them. If a child my age was doing something that got attention, I wanted them to stop, and if they retaliated physically as some of the bigger kids do, well, I never saw them again. There were so many bad days, and I was barely ever content when things didn't go my way. I saw my mother less and less, and soon educators were eventually replaced with entertainers, clowns, jugglers, players, and toy makers. The more days I spent being entertained, the more of a harsh critic I became. I had an edge on the playground when I talked about what my school was like to the other kids. They started wanting to be my friend. A lot of them started listening to me, knowing that if they played with me, they would be rewarded. The shows and level of entertainment their parents couldn't provide. Friends were also allowed to talk to my servants the way I did, getting what they wanted for a while. They were in my company, and that was nice for a little while. Until other parents started saying no, because they were mirroring my behavior. That's when the direct insults started flying. Bastard child, royal brat, corrupted princess. Every now and then a servant would step in before things got physical with parents, but a couple of times I got slapped in the face hard. The first few times I told my caregiver, my mother wasn't around enough to listen to all my complaints when things got physical with grown-ups. Just like the kids, I never saw the parents again, but that also meant that I didn't see the friends I wanted to play with. And then later I wasn't allowed to go to the park or play with other kids again. When in the Sunwell, if I saw parents and children, they would avoid me like I had a plague, and I heard the term, terror of the Sunwell, thrown around more than a few times. Things were lonely, and keeping me locked up with whatever toys I wanted seemed like the best option. Not just because I would break things and try to hit people, but also my rage and tantrums would cause me to hurt myself. I would scream, hit my head against things, and scratch myself. That pretty much stopped my teachers from wanting to be near me regardless of how much they were paid. A few times they were blamed for the damages I self-inflicted on myself. There was a time when small baby animals might keep my interest, and yes, for a time they were cute and cuddly, and it was entertaining to watch them eat and play, but the moment I stepped in a pile of their feces, I didn't want them anymore. Usually I threw them outside of the Sunwell Plateau where they might have found new families, were eaten by predators, or brought back to me. From there I usually kept them in a small room or tied to a chain farther outside until they starved to death. Few of their corpses were brought back to the estate. One of them was taken to my mother. A black and white cat that kept getting thrown in my room like garbage. It was the partial cat that liked to defecate right on top of my writing desk. The chaining of animals outside was something I usually did with dogs, but this cat was fed by the servants and slaves, so it kept coming back and getting tossed in my room while I was asleep. I woke up before anyone was up, trapped it in a blanket, and tied it to a chain and tree and left it there. After not seeing my mother for more than 5 minutes a day for a whole year, she confronted me with this and threw the dead cat at my feet. "Well?" she said angrily. I looked in the bag and saw the blank dead eyes, and she smelled like rotting meat. I rolled my eyes and looked at her. "It scratched me," I said blankly. "So you killed it?" she asked. I never wanted it, but it kept coming back, so I made sure that it didn't. She looked at me in disbelief. "I've heard some disturbing rumors about you, Perfectia. Would you care to read the letters I've received from your cousins?" I shrugged. She handed me a piece of paper. "Read it out loud," she ordered. "Perfectia Dawnlight is such a sweet and charming girl. We wish you would bring her by so she can come to all of our parties." I read. "You think that's funny?" My mother stood up higher than anyone I've ever met from her writing desk and snatched the parchment away. I knew that look. It was the same look grown-ups gave me before they were about to hit me. I remember the first time someone hit me. It hurt so badly that I cried, but later I found that that parent was arrested because of my family. The next time someone hit me, I accepted the pain, without tears, knowing full well that before it happened and after it happened, they had just signed their own death warrant. "That's what it says," I said dismissively, looking at her, baiting her like I had the other parents on the playground. A faint smile crept on the side of my face. My mother looked at me suspiciously. "Read it again," sounded out Perfectia slowly. I didn't understand what that meant. I had seen letters before. I even knew what they were all called. I could write my own name and could even recognize it if I saw it, but I had no idea what the concept of phonics was. She walked toward me slowly. I looked at her with a sense of anger. Narrowing my eyes, I tightened my jaw, readying for the swift slap across my face, jaw, or head. She picked me up and sat me down on her writing desk, put me on her lap, dropped her quill and ink, and gave it to me. Perfectia, I want you to write a letter A. Her voice was distorted like she was about to start crying. I did as I was told for the first time in a long time. Now what sound does the A make? I don't know, I stated. I've spent so much time with that child prodigy, I barely heard her whisper that. What? I asked. Nothing. I heard her sniff and I felt a tear fall on the back of my head. We're moving to Silvermoon City tomorrow, she stated. She ran me through all the letters one by one, and I wasn't sure if someone had said them to me, or maybe I had forgotten. Reading was something I hated, but we made it all the way to the J's before I was too tired to continue. I was 6 at the time, and I didn't know or really care about what my mother did that kept her away from me for almost 3 years. But there we were taking a boat across the water to the big high elf city of Silvermoon. From what I heard, most of the entertainers that would come by had been from there, but not all of them were high elves. My mother told me I was going to go to a school and would only be taking short trips back to the Sunwell Plateau if I was sick or injured. What about Grandpa and all my cousins? I asked. My mother rolled her eyes, sighed, and shook her head. You have a few here, and besides, did you really see many of them when we were back home? I thought back, and the only time I could remember seeing any of them was during my birthdays. Not really. I answered. Are we going to still have servants? My mother laughed. Maybe, but not as many as before, and you're going to have to start being nicer to them from now on. I'm always nice to servants, Mommy. They like how I treat them. I argued. My mother looked at me suspiciously. What makes you think they like the way you treat them, Perfectia? If they didn't like how I treated them, they would work hard to be rich like us. I recited, and yes, I was completely serious. Where did you hear that? She asked. I looked at her. Grandpa. She looked away from me and chuckled at the thought. We will most likely not have servants. I will be changing you from now on. So, we had a single bedroom apartment where we kept most of the clothes and linen with a bed and a writing desk. The living room was mostly kept to me where all my toys and collectibles were. School was a place with kids without parents, with one grown-up telling everyone what to do. It was uncomfortable to say the least, especially since my name didn't have the same pull as it did on the Sunwell Plateau, but it was good because the teacher didn't once try to hit me or call me names. If I threw a tantrum, the class would continue, or I would be sent outside. I did try to run away, only to be dragged back by city guards that patrolled the school and sent back to my class. The daily routine was to get up, take a bath, and my mother would dress me. By the time we left the house, someone was already coming into our apartment. Mother said she was a friend, but I knew she was a servant. She dropped me off at school, and when it was over, she was there to take me home. When we got home, it was clean, the laundry was done, and a fresh half-barrel of water was ready. The bed was made and a meal was ready that was somehow always hot. Well, I didn't know what it was at the time, but she was heating up the plate using arcane fire magic, and she was most likely doing this with the bath water as well. She would just put her hands in the water until it was a temperature I liked. Then we would use the writing desk to do whatever homework I had. After I finished, I would go into the living room and play with my toys, look at picture books, or draw. Mother would take a bath, and when she got out, she would tell me it's time for bed and change me into night clothes, and I would go to sleep in her arms. There were still bad times I didn't want to eat at all. I wanted to take a boat back to the Sunwell. I wanted some other form of entertainment other than what I had, or having books being read aloud, but the routine was something that I needed to be fixed on. If we fell behind schedule, or she didn't have a coffee or a thistle tea, she would get really moody. She would pull me painfully if we were running late, and sometimes she would have these loud screaming what?s if I was bothering her, followed by an apology and an excuse that she had a headache. Some days there was just nothing that could make her happy, and those were the weekdays we both took an unscheduled trip to the Sunwell, which was about a 2 to 3 hour boat ride, depending on the weather. Sometimes even after I was asleep, I would see her sitting at her writing desk scratching away in a large book or some kind of parchment. LaChance did show up a few times to take over for Mother's routine, but I acknowledged him as a servant even though I never treated him as bad as I did the ones at the Sunwell Plateau. Some days LaChance would come by to walk us both to school, and those were the days Mother bought something from a paper bag food place, and I would come home to a mess. I think back on it now, and I think they were being intimate. But my times with my unbeknownst father were days I could get away with more. I even managed to convince him to take me outside the gates of Silvermoon. There was a slave boy with red hair that would come by and play with me, but playing with him, I was actually being cruel to him. Pitching him, pulling on his hair, burning him with candle fire, or poking him with needles didn't seem to faze him. He was no different from a servant, just a little bit older than me. I was able to pry at him when I told lies about him and his mother. That got through to him. I could hurt him emotionally if I said that I knew where his mother was, or if I arranged a fake meeting with her. He waited throughout the day and all night until the following morning. The next day I saw him crying, but even for how cruel and spoiled I was, how I took so much pleasure in people's suffering, I couldn't help but regret going that far. I held him as he cried, and I felt really bad because I didn't know who my father was, and I had been called all kinds of nasty names when I was living in Dawnstar Village and would come to the open areas where kids played. I was nice to him from that point on, well, as nice as I could be. I was still extremely bossy and short-tempered, but didn't want to make his life a living hell, and I didn't want anyone else messing with him either. Redworm was his name, but I just called him Red, and my mother was glad that I was keeping a friend that I wasn't mean to. I saw him almost every day after school, and I even got out of some of the homework that I needed to do. Weekends we spent most of the day together, and my mother was even considering adopting him. My mother showed up at Red's slave master's home and offered to pay for him, but his master said he needed to think about it. She offered more, but he said he needed to think about it. He didn't need to think about it, because he knew who we were, nobles from the Dawnstar house. Red's slave master knew just by the way my mother talked. One day me and Red were out playing, and his master put a sack over my head and bonded my hands together, and I had no idea where I was going. That night Red came and unlocked me and told me to run as far as I could, and I did, but I didn't know where to go. I ran into a tribe of trolls in the forest, and I was kidnapped again. They kept me in a cage this time, and they kept putting food in there. There was something strange about these trolls. They could make something like the Sunwell with their drum music, dancing, and fire rituals. It all tasted really nice, and I felt the urge to dance in my cage, so they let me out to dance with the other trolls. I put my hand on one of their gems that they kept by the flames, and for as close as it was to the bonfire, it was slightly cold. It made a silky sweet milk hit the middle of my tongue, and it was cold, but a good cold. I could understand what the trolls were saying, and I could speak to them with the gems in my hand. They said I needed to start working, and I couldn't use the juju every day. I would have to learn the troll language little by little. I thought I was going to have to go to school again, but the next day they taught me how to fish, and that was actually fun. It wasn't fun cleaning nets though. It smelled awful, but I had little hands. They had these big 3-fingered hands, so I did it. I also wasn't the only one doing it. There were troll kids of various ages doing it as well. Later the troll kids taught me how to swim, and without much success, tried to teach me how to use spears. I think I threw one tantrum while I was with the tribe. I threw myself on the ground and started losing myself in a fit of anger. I was picked up immediately by the woman who I shared a hut with, and she hugged and shushed me like I was a baby. I didn't know what she was saying, but I do remember the term berserking being used as she passed me to several other troll women, as if my rage was a symptom and a hug and some loving hums and songs were the treatment. It appears that it is, because I haven't had one since then. Not every night was a fire dance party, but every night was a story of events of sorts, heavily gestured in thrilling or comical fashion. They would tap me on the back and go into a story mimicking a fish I caught or a silly thing I did, and few of those stories ended in applause. Everything was harvested, hunted, or grown, so everything tasted really good. There were also the dinosaurs. While I was afraid of them at first, the ones I did meet were especially affectionate. When one would rest their head on my lap, well, those things I did to those smaller pets. Well, the guilt was really settling in. Tima was the name of the troll woman I shared a hut with. She would find me in tears every now and then. She would hug me and pass me the same way she did before. Sometimes to men every now and then. I wanted to tell them that I missed my mother, that I had come from a noble house, that we could be friends if they brought me back home, but there was a part of me that didn't want to go back. No, I didn't want to go back after being neglected, abandoned, and hurt. It was nice to be seen, appreciated, and validated, and I wasn't hungry to be near the Sunwell because of their gems. I must have been there for about a month or two, and I think they were going to set up a bed or hammock for me, but I slept in that cage the whole time I was there, like it was my own bed. They gave me blankets, but that's not what my mother and the group of high elves she brought to that encampment saw. I think she must have thought they were going to eat me. I never knew what a mage did until that day. I thought it was like any other job, like a librarian or an artist or a record keeper. My mother burned them mercilessly. She told me to look away, but I didn't. I told her to stop, but she couldn't hear me from all the screaming and burning huts. The cage I was in wasn't even locked. I tried to hurt her in a way a 7-year-old could. I tried to hit her. I told her I hated her, and I told her so many times to stop killing them. I called them out by name when they were consumed with fire, but it didn't stop her from killing anyone. She stood there dismissing me, like another one of my tantrums, all the while casting fireballs on huts and frost bolts on trolls. Until I said, Ibastasala, to Masrin, which meant, your soul is dust, parent. They didn't have words for mother or father. That got her attention. These words aren't translating when I ask someone to proofread, so if I write something in troll, I'll just tell you what I said. Maybe I'm not spelling it right. What did you say? She finally ordered them to stop. I cursed in as many troll phases as I could. Some of these were just greetings, but I made them sound like curse words. Eventually my mother slapped me, but this wasn't like those hits from the parents from the park. This felt like my neck had cracked and she knocked me flat on the floor. While I was there, I could feel the left side of my face swell up. I remembered the words, Adash Varan Kata, which meant, in the end lies glory, and chanted that phrase as I was crying on the ground. I remember her saying, I told you not to speak that savage tongue. She picked me up by my left hand, seeming to want to hit me if I didn't stop chanting, but she looked around confused at the ground, and it was glowing with yellow fire. She picked me up and tiptoed painfully out of the holy area. She walked to her servants with me in her arms. Do you know what spell that was? She asked. They looked behind her and the glowing had stopped. No. All the trolls are dead or fleeing. Did you want us to track them down? Mother shook her head. No. Perfectia is safe. I bit her arm as hard as I could and she let me go. I ran over to the fire and took one of the gems that was by the fire, and I've kept it with me to this day. It reminds me of a lot of things. I did, however, try to keep running away to no avail. One of Mother's apprentices caught me and brought me kicking and screaming back to her. I calmed down a bit on the way back to Silvermoon City, and I told my mother I wanted to go back home and to take Red with us. Mother told me that I wasn't going to want to see him again. I went back to the slave master's house and saw him. He was walking around with a stick because they cut out his eyes. I don't think he knew I was there. But she was right. I didn't want to see that, and I couldn't bring myself to say goodbye to him. When we went back to Dawnstar Village, things were very different for me. I thought when I moved into a one-bedroom apartment with my mother, and also when I was living in a hut, that I had moved into extreme poverty. I was being forced to live among peasantry, but this felt so much worse than all those times. I thought because of my nobility I was somehow higher, but I realized that I couldn't have been more wrong. Going back to nobility was when I was impoverished. I know many people would disagree, but I felt truly poor. My servants couldn't believe how much my personality had changed as I displayed habits that suited living with the community as I tried to set up tables, arrange the food on the table, even cleaning the tables and dishes after we were done. I was scolded for that, and I remembered my uncles and older cousins asking me how I suffered being around savages. They would ask me to say a few words in troll and I would. If I said something like, Shoka abasit hisra, Marad astarit, Marad atwasit, abanakun, Maras shoka, which meant, struggle is an illusion. The tide rises, the tide falls, but the sea is changeless. There is nothing to struggle against, which was a prayer for healing. They would assume that it meant, rip out his tongue and boil him in oil, or something of a violent nature. I remember one of my cousins, a little older than me, pushing me during my welcome home party. He told me I was still a bastard and was more disgusting since I was corrupted by those savages. He shared my last name, Kulik Dawnlight, whose both parents were nobility, and I realized that I was looking at my former self.